Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good afternoon. My name is Amy Draves, and I'm here to introduce and welcome Robert Trivers, who is joining us as part of the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. Robert is here today to discuss his book, The Folly of Fools, The Logic of Deceit and Self-Deception in Human Life. Self-deception warps our view of the world and can have terrible consequences. So why does deception play such a prominent role in our everyday lives? The short answer is that we do it for biological reasons. The longer answer will be illuminated shortly. Dr. Trivers is a professor of anthropology and biological sciences at Rutgers University and the winner of the Crawford Prize in 2007 for his fundamental analysis of social evolution, conflict, and cooperation. Please join me in welcoming him to Microsoft.
Well, thank you for the introduction and more especially the invitation. Thanks for turning out. It's a pleasure to be here. I've written a book on deceit and self-deception, lying to others and lying to yourself. And people that are relatively truth-oriented, as I take you people to be, may sometimes be a little bit naive about the underbelly of all this, the amount of untruth, the amount of lying, the amount of deception, and the amount of self-deception. Although God knows if you read the newspaper these days, we're flooded by it. From every corner of this country, Washington, D.C., and then wherever the latest debate is. So one can hardly be completely naive about it. But in any case, deception is no problem explaining in biology. It's found at all levels. So there are bacteria that will imitate parts of your body to evade the immune system and get in. HIV, which causes AIDS, of course, changes its coat proteins at such a rate that the organism cannot mount an immune response that works against an HIV strain that might hit it 6 months or a year later, and that's one reason why you can't easily come up with a vaccine against it. Prey hide from their predators, camouflage and so on. Vice versa, predators hide from prey. Sometimes prey imitate noxious objects like poisonous snakes in order to frighten. This will be an insect looking like a poisonous snake to frighten birds or lizards that prey on it. Likewise, within species, we have a whole armload of examples of deception. Insects, birds, mammals, etc. And it's easy enough to see situations in which you can gain a benefit, ultimately biologically measured in terms of reproductive success, that is, production of surviving offspring, or better put, genetic success, where we include not just surviving offspring, but effects on collateral relatives, where each of these effects are devalued by the appropriate degree of relatedness compared to personal reproduction. So, for example, to give you an obvious example from just daily life, let's just take a couple and we can discuss deceptions, which if you get away with, you can gain a benefit. So you can tell your wife, Maria, that you love her to death and she's the only one in your life and you'd never consider anybody else. Meanwhile, you have a baby by another woman down the road. Or if you're a governor of a state, hell, you may have the baby right in the home. So as long as Maria don't find out, that may give you a benefit. When she finds out, you're apt to pay for it. Now, that marriage may have been about to end anyway, but it sure ended with the discovery of that. Now, if you put the shoe on the other foot, a woman can easily lie to a man, show him a baby, and say, this is yours. And we know from birds from the 1980s, when we started to be able to do DNA very precisely, that a striking percentage of the offspring in many songbirds that are being raised by a male are not genetically his. 20 to 40% is a common estimate. There's one wren, where it's over 50% of the offspring are not the offspring of the male who's raising them. Now, from the female standpoint, we know that she can benefit from such an arrangement if the genes of the male that fathers her extra pair offspring are superior in survival value or eventual reproduction than the genes of the male who's raising them. And we have very good evidence from several species that females are biased in their choice for extra pair copulations towards exactly such males. But they got to hide it from their mate, and we have evidence that when they don't hide it, or when the mate knows or suspects, he may cut down on his parental investment. So, back to the human situation, and you're presented with a child and told it's not really. There's a real nice expression from Senegal that I learned when I was there, which summarizes this from the male standpoint: better an ugly child that looks like you than a good-looking child that looks like your neighbor. Okay? And so explaining deception has never been a problem. Now, sometimes people are naive about the force of deception, and again, it's truth-oriented people that are sometimes naive. Let's take someone you may have heard of, Bill Gates, I think is his name, and in 2004, he famously predicted that spam would be a thing of the past by 2006. Well, I don't know when you last checked your computer, but it's chock-a-block full of spam. So what he could do, and computer experts could do at the time, is easily see how they could erect defenses against the then popular forms of spamming, which indeed they did. But what he didn't see was how easy it was for the spammers to come up with tricks that overcame those defenses, and indeed generate new tricks to which they would have to invent defenses. So often in life, deception takes the lead, and it takes truth or detection of deception is playing catch up. Okay, so anyway, regardless of such matters as to how naive one is about the power of deception in life, the logic is simple. You can gain something. But what about self-deception? That resembles stealing from yourself. I mean, if I take $5 out of this pocket and put it in this pocket, where's the net gain? If I'm deceiving myself, I'm both victimizer and victim. So where's the gain? And it's been a classic problem in human thought ever since people started writing down their thoughts. In your major religions, there are various kinds of teachings against self-deception. Some of the Eastern religions are more deep and sophisticated than Western religions on this, but just take Jesus' famous teachings on judge not that ye be not judged, for with the judgment you pronounce shall ye be judged. Why do you see the mote in your neighbor's eye and fail to see the beam in your own eye? Thou hypocrite, first remove the beam from thine own eye, the better to see the mote in your neighbor's eye. So this is all about, to me, self-deception. Stop denying your own faults and projecting and seeing them on others. Get rid of your own first if you want to see the other person accurately. And needless to say, Jesus ain't in favor of self-deception. But what's the explanation for it? Why is it so prevalent? What's its function? There have been pretenders to the throne. Freud was an example, and he had some interesting concepts and thoughts about self-deception: denial, projection, ego defense mechanisms, reaction formation, so on. But he wedded that to a thoroughly corrupt view of human development. Anal, oral, Oedipal phases. All you women are running around wishing you had a dick. Not one to use, but one tied to yourself. And meanwhile, all us men are running around fearful that our father's going to cut our balls off. I mean, just utter fantasy, utter nonsense. Stuff he made up while snorting too much cocaine. And pretending that you can lay the foundation for a science by just dreaming up whatever you want. That's true of economics, by the way. It ain't no science. It pretends to be, gives itself a Nobel Prize, has an elaborate mathematical structure, but it fails to do one of the most elementary things of a science, which is to ground yourself in pre-existing knowledge. We're happy to have physics sitting on math, chemistry sitting on physics, biology sitting on chemistry, and someday, we hope and pray, the social so-called sciences sitting on biology. Where else are they going to sit? We came here through 3 billion years of natural selection and evolution. Any functional view of life has to be based on that. So one of these days they're going to have to hook it up. But economists don't do it. They say, we maximize utility. So you say to an economist, what's utility? And he says, well, anything you want to maximize. Sometimes it's money, sometimes it's food over money, sometimes sex trumps both of them. So then you need preference functions that describe when it is I prefer sex over food versus money and so on. It's hopeless for even one individual for you to describe my preference functions. You have to know the time of day, whole set of other variables and so forth and so on, where I'm in my life. And what they imagine, though, is that they can have this empty concept, utility, and then somehow build a so-called science upwards from it. Utter nonsense. And one of the things they do is confuse personal utility with general utility, and they often argue that they're closely aligned. And I don't know, I'm particularly sensitive to it because if you watch the kind of nonsense that was generated in the last 10 or 20 years, which helped bring about this near economic collapse from which a lot of people are still suffering very acutely now in this country, you hear all kinds of garbage, Greenspan saying the forces of the market will naturally constrain deception or greed or whatnot. Nonsense. We know plenty of examples from other animals where that's not true. All right, so let's get to the point. What's the function of self-deception? My argument has been, or the insight I thought I had a number of years ago, is that self-deception evolves in the service of deceit. It's a way of making your deception harder to detect. So let's imagine I'm lying to you now about something you actually care about. You're close to me. Better yet, you know something about me. Then you can study any of the signs of conscious self-knowledge of the fact that I'm consciously lying towards you as evidence. For example, if we tell a lie, when we come to the key word, we almost always have the pitch of our voice go up. And that's virtually an inevitable consequence of the fact that we put a strain on ourselves, and whenever you strain this part in the diaphragm, up goes your voice. Now, in principle, you could sit there and meditate otherwise. I'm coming to the key word, so relax, Robert. Take a deep breath, stick your gut out, don't tense up, and you might slip it through, but that's an awful lot of work. And in fact, one of the best cues to consciously mediated deception is the voice going up. Now, I had an absurd example of that happened in my life a couple years ago. A woman was denying something I was not accusing her of, which was having a homosexual relationship with another woman. So she said, "You think I'm there with Sherry?" And her voice shoots up 2 octaves, not just a couple of notes, because her voice broke on the key word, which was, I said to myself, well, I did have a theory, and now I have more evidence to support the theory. Or what about our eye movements? I used to think that they move nervously, but that's not the case. And nervousness is one of the poorer predictors of deceit. We're all conscious of it. We think nervousness is going to be a cue, and partly because of consciousness we may suppress signs of it, but there's another more fundamental reason, which is that under cognitive load, that is, if I have to create a lie right now, it's intellectually demanding. I have to create a falsehood that's plausible on its face, that I can say in a convincing manner, which does not contradict anything you know or are about to know, and which I can remember. And that cognitive load has opposite effects on variables associated with nervousness. For example, we blink more if we're made nervous. But if you're asked to add a set of numbers, you blink less than someone who's not being asked to do anything cognitive. So which trumps which? Well, in deception, cognitive load trumps nervousness, so you blink less when you're acting deceptively. Now, going back to the movement of our eyes, what really happens is the following. If I'm telling you a lie that I'm making up right now, I look away from you to an empty part of space to complete the lie, then I look back on you, because it's too damn hard to make it up while this extra cognitive load of you looking at me while I'm looking at you. And then likewise, you can have pauses while you have to dream up these lies. There are verbal characteristics. This has been shown with computer work, very nice computer work. The word I tends to decrease dramatically because you're distancing yourself from the I. Qualifiers disappear. You don't say, although it was raining, I walked to the Microsoft campus. You just say, I walked to the Microsoft campus. You don't add details that cost you more to invent and are harder to remember and so on. So my argument is simply, if I'm unconscious of the lying, if I've rendered the damn thing unconscious, then first of all, the invention of the lie can be done unconsciously, but also those cues that I'm giving off, the voice, the having to move the eye, these other kinds of cues are unavailable to you. Or let me give you a second example, which is consistent with what I'm talking about here, but it's a special case. We're all into, or most of us, and on average all of us are into self-enhancement. All right, I'm smarter than I really am. I'm more useful to you than I really am. I'm a nicer person, and trust me, that's a lie, than I really am. I'm better looking than I am, and if you really want to see me at my best, catch me on the dance floor. All right? So now, the point is that if you believe those things, you are apt to be, so I claim, more convincing in projecting it. I'll come back to that in a moment, but let me give you two little verbal things that we do unconsciously that relate to shifting, blame, and so on. If I do something that has positive effects on you, then I take an active voice. I did that, I did this, and then benefits rain down on you from heaven. But if it's negative consequences on you, then I don't take no active voice. I'm a victim of circumstances. These things happened, then that happened, then unfortunately you suffered costs. And to me, one of the nicest examples of this was a guy that ran into a telephone pole in San Francisco some 20 years ago or more, and is actually recorded by the police. His description was as follows: the pole was approaching my car when I attempted to swerve out of the way, and it struck me. So we know from physics, perfectly legitimate description, but it shifted the attention or the responsibility of the telephone pole. Or let me give you another example. Let's let you be a member of the out group and you be a member of my in group, and it's a verbal change depending on what happens. So let's say you do something nice for me. I say, she's a nice and considerate person. Let's say you do the same thing. I don't generalize, I'm specific. He gave me a glass of water. But let's do it the other way around. Let's say you bumped into me. Then I say, you bumped into me. But him now I generalize. I say he's a clumsy and inconsiderate person. And we do this quite unconsciously. Generalize or specify depending on in-group, out-group. Well, let me go back to the self-inflation business a second, because there's been a beautiful piece of work on it that I think will amuse you. All right, so if you ask high school seniors in the U.S. how many of them think they're in the top half of their class for leadership ability, 80% say they are. Can't be true. But as you may know, you can hardly beat academics for self-deception. So fully 94% of professors in the United States regard themselves as being in the top half of their profession. And I plead guilty. I can be tied down to a bed in the back ward of Seattle General Hospital, and I still think I'm doing better than half my colleagues. And that's not just a comment on my colleagues, right? But are we just flabbing our mouth, as they would say in Jamaica? Is this just what we're saying? Or do we actually, let's say, on looks, do I actually think I'm better looking, or am I just saying it? So now here's the work that suggests that we actually think we're better looking, or that in our inner eye sees us as better looking. Here's what they did. They would let us imagine it's you. they take a photo of you, and then they morph your face with the help of a computer to make it better looking or uglier. And they do that by getting, let's say you're a woman, they take 60 women and they have a panel of just a few judges pick out the 15 best looking. Then they take those 15 and average their faces together. That makes it even better looking than the average of the individual faces. And then they add increasing percentages of that face to your face. So at 50%, you're half and half, okay? Or they morph you towards someone with craniofacial syndrome, which distorts your face and makes you look uglier. Fine. Now, here's the game they play with you then. So they've taken a picture of you, they've morphed it, and let's just use the 20% uglier and the 20% better looking. So here's what they do. You're sitting in front of a computer screen, blingo, 12 faces appear, matched for your age and sex, one of which is yours. Now, your job is simply, as soon as you spot it, hit that button with your hand and then point to it. That controls for errors, okay? And they emphasize, speed that we want here, speed of response. Okay, but here's the game. In some of the runs, it's real you. In some of the runs, it's 20% better looking you, and in some of the runs, it's 20% uglier you. So which do you see first? Well, you see better looking you first. Takes you 1.86 seconds. Okay, it takes you 5% longer to see real you, and 5% longer still to see ugly you. So in your mind's eye, you're 20% better looking. Now, if they show you the full range of 11 faces, that is your real one, and then 10, 20, 30, 50, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 here, and ask you which one you like the most, you pick out 20% better looking as the one you like the most. If they ask you which one you think is you, and mind you, you got the real you in front of your face, then you're roughly on average 15% better. In other words, half of them taking 10% better, half 20. So it's on average 15% better. So it's bounded, which makes obvious sense, 30% might be implausible. 10% I'm not getting enough of the gain in there. So it really seems as if in our mind's eye, we think of ourselves as better looking. Now, I don't need no damn social psychologist to tell me this, because if I'm in a big city, walking along, talking to a younger and attractive woman, not up to nothing, you understand, just trying to make her like me enough to allow me to remain nearby. So I'm walking along here, and I'm giving her my little shuck and jive and so on, and sometimes I'll spot on the other side of her an old man, white hair, face falling apart, and not even walking, kind of shambling, And then I realize, oh, that's me reflected in the store windows behind her. So self-deceived me sees real me as ugly me, okay? Now, they've done another experiment that's kind of nice, which I'll briefly mention to you. Oh, sorry, no, before I'll do it, here's a paper that came out just 2 months ago after my book came out, or was just about to come out. They looked at self-enhancement across 15 human societies, including Sweden, including Japan, including the US, okay? And they had a simple measure of self-enhancement. There's 2 or 3 questions they ask, how much are you such and such 1 to 7? Okay, so it's a measure of self-enhancement. Here's the correlation, and it's quite strong. It correlates very strongly with income inequality. The less income inequality, the less self-inflation. The more income inequality, the more self-inflation. Yesterday at town hall, a Japanese-American fellow asked me about this, and he said, Japanese people, don't tend to go in for self-inflation. I said, indeed they don't, and they have much more equitable income distribution than the U.S. Sweden, they're virtually, everybody's virtually earning the same amount. Of course, I'm exaggerating. So they're not going in for self-inflation much. The U.S., as you know, has got an inequitable distribution that's getting worse. So if we keep it up, we'll be self-inflating at 30%, 5 or 10 years down the road. And it makes an obvious kind of intuitive sense that, at least for money, if there's no competition for the money because everybody's earning the same amount, why bother with the self-inflation? Now, of course, there's still the matter of good looks and those kind of things. But I think that's a very interesting recent result that shows that this thing is adjusted to, I think, GIN or something. GINN is the economic measure of income inequality. Now, let's see. With that overly long introduction I had, I'm not sure I have too much time left, so let me skip this other example and go on to, well, hell, I could amuse you with this. All right, let me amuse you with this for 2 seconds, and then I want to go into immunology of self-deception, because it was something I didn't know about when I started working intensively on this book about 5 years ago. In Georgia, they ran some amusing experiments with A1 heterosexual men. What's an A1 heterosexual man? That's a man who's never had a homosexual experience, nor a homosexual fantasy, nor a homosexual thought, or so he says, okay? And then they divide them into those that are relatively homophobic and not. Now, homophobia is a misnomer. It's not fear of homosexuals as much as aggression toward them. And the measure is, how much discomfort would you feel, how much anger would you feel, blah, 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 blah. It's just one of these damn questionnaires. But you can segregate people into those that are hyper upset and those that are relaxed. Now, here's the fun part. They tie a plethysmograph around the base of each man's wood, as they call that organ in Jamaica, and it measures changes in circumference very accurately. Then they show them dirty movies, all right? Now, 6 minutes of a pornographic film. Now, if this is male and female, and we got wood size here as a function of time, and it's 6 minutes, it grows admirably throughout. All right, now the ones for homophobic and non-homophobic are statistically indistinguishable, so we don't have to identify them, right? Now, if it's watching two women make love, the thing starts nice, but for certain reasons it tapers off earlier here. But once again, there's no difference between the two kinds of men. Well, I think you're probably guessing what's going on down here. Now we're watching two men get it on. The non-homophobic men show a slight and statistically insignificant increase in tumescence. The homophobic men show a steady increase, starts to take off here. They get 2/3 of the way up to watching two lesbians. Okay? Now, really, we know this is a daily occurrence. Well, not a daily occurrence, a monthly occurrence in our society. Some preacher or some politician who's taken a public stand against male homosexuality gets outed for his secret homosexual life. Whether it's as pathetic as looking for love in a Minneapolis airport bathroom stall. Yeah, how romantic can you get? Or some of these other things. So this is a case of denial, projection, and then attacking what you're projecting. And you can add Freud's term of reaction formation, which is when there's something inside you that you dislike, you take a reaction against it, you deny it, and then the negativity is expressed outwards. But I think the negativity is often a really kind of a form of camouflage. Okay, now let me switch to talking about the immune effects of self-deception, because you really cannot get a deeper view of what the costs are. And you understand throughout this is a cost-benefit analysis. Being out of touch with reality has some unfortunate downstream consequences. But for an evolutionary argument, we first want to get this phenomenon of self-deception lifted off the ground and evolving, and then the more sophisticated form of the argument is to weigh the costs and benefits, and that's going to constrain its evolution. I'm not going to talk much about the costs, but in any case, the immune effects are examples of costs and maybe one example of benefit. So let me give you an example of cost. If you bring people into the lab and ask them to state, these are adults, the most traumatic event in their life. It's usually a childhood event. The most traumatic is sexual abuse. Physical abuse, like being beaten repeatedly by the parent, can be traumatic. A divorce. Children are usually not happy. They're going to lose one parent, etc., etc. So anyway, they got to name the most traumatic thing in their life. They got to say a few things about it. Then you split them into two groups. One group writes in a private journal 3 days running for 20 minutes about the trauma. The other group write about what they did that day. They're the control group, okay? Now, here's the interesting finding. Your mood goes down if you're writing about the trauma because you're having to relive something that's negative. You like to suppress it and keep it out. Okay. However, your immune system starts improving immediately. And 3 months later, your immune system is still elevated, and by now your mood has caught up with your immune system, if you will, and it's elevated above the control group, which is just flatlining on all these variables. So this is a very important result, that sharing trauma, even in a private journal, has immune benefits, and those in turn affect mood in a positive way. Now, we did not evolve writing in private journals, so this is probably reflects the benefits of sharing it with another person, although you could in principle share it with the Lord in prayer, as some people urge you to do it. And just like nobody's reading your private journal except you, there may not be anyone on the other end of the line while you're praying, but if you're sharing it, it may have a beneficial effect. Now, if you look at adults, we know that trauma is associated, especially when we know that trauma is associated with health problems in adulthood, but it's especially true of sexual trauma, which of course is especially common for girls, not boys as in Penn State. It goes both ways, but it's more common with girls. And it turns out that sexual trauma is the least shared trauma of any trauma in childhood. More than half of women did not tell a soul. Not even their own mother. It's shameful. They feel guilty. They think maybe they brought it on. And furthermore, there may be a situation like it's from their stepfather. So telling mom can create problems. There's situations where mom denies it because she's in denial and wants to protect the marriage. The child may not want to harm the marriage and so on. Whatever the reasons are, we're pretty confident from various lines of evidence that the reason why sexual trauma has such negative effects on the immune system. You can measure the immune parameters, and likewise, they just have a lot of sickness. They catch colds and have these other kinds of chronic conditions. Results from the lack of sharing of the trauma, more than the trauma per se. Okay? Yes, did you want to say something?
What's the connection between the self-deception and the immune suppression? How does it affect that?
Well, dear, if I could answer that, I'd have a major paper in press in Nature or Science. I tried repeatedly to work it out, and the information just ain't there. First, I started thinking about the brain. See, the immune system is an extremely expensive system. And in nature, roughly 30% of mortality or variation in reproductive success is due to parasites. It's a major selective effect, much more important than predators. So in any case, we produce every 2 weeks 3 grapefruit-sized set of tissues in our immune system. The lifespan of a white blood cell is 2 weeks. That's not the half-life, that's the full life. And so we got to replenish our white blood cells, even absent an infection. Every 2 weeks, we got to produce a new set of them. Okay, so it's an extremely expensive system in both proteins and energy, and we can draw down on it for other purposes. So I tried to work out the logic along those lines. It's better for me to just tell you I ain't got it solved, and it's going to take a while for it to be solved. It almost certainly requires that we understand which chemicals are common to both, are important both in brain function and in immune function. We know, for example, well, let me just end by saying that, okay? The book Wander, you know, I was a big scientist on my knees, you know, and I got a couple of examples where we know of chemicals that work in both situations, but that's not an answer to your question, okay? Your direct question cannot be answered at present. Not by me. Let me mention, let me mention one analogy that I do mention in the book. We've known since the 1980s that the reason why females in so many species of animals like brightly colored males is because bright coloration is hard to achieve if you're sick or have suffered parasite load. So by choosing the brightest colored male bird or whatnot, you are most likely to get a male who's got parasite-resistant genes, which are then valuable for your offspring. So why this relationship between color and signs of sickness? It was just one of those arbitrary things until in the 1990s they showed that carotenoids, which are your reds, yellows, and oranges, are major chemicals in our immune system. And if you're sick, a bird's beak, if it's bright red, will turn pale because the body is sucking the carotenoids out of the beak, putting them in the immune system to fight the infection. I know you're sitting there looking at me like, when are you going to get to my point? I'm not going to get to it, so let me stand over here and not deal with that pressure anymore, okay? So let me give you, if you guys can stand it, let me give you one other example on the immune side, and then I think I'll tell you something about cheating in science that might amuse you. All right. Let's return to homosexuality now, but on the other end, let's talk about males that are primarily, and I mean 98% or completely homosexual. Now we know there's this phenomenon of being in the closet. So you can be in the closet where only 2 heterosexual friends know about this side of yourself. You can be partway out of the closet where 5 know and your parents or 1 parent. You can be out there where, you know, the people at work know and your friends, but others know, and then whoop-de-doo. You can be over here where everybody knows you're gay, even if they don't know you, because you're flaunting it, okay? Now, which one do you think is better for your health? Is it suppressing your identity and living a double life and living a lie and having to practice some self-deception, which the former, which I'll skip for a moment, as part of it? Or is it being out there, out of the closet? What's your guess? Who says it's more healthy to be in the closet? Show of good hands. Who thinks it's better to be out of the closet? Well, I'm sorry to say you're all right. Okay, it's more fun when the audience goes the wrong way, but they don't go wrong on this one, you know. Now, the data are unambiguous, and it's easiest to present by talking those that are halfway in the closet or halfway out. But in fact, if you graph it, it works by each category. In other words, it's a correlation that's quite robust. But if you're HIV negative, you suffer from cancer more often and bronchitis on opposite ends of danger to you if you're in the closet. If you're HIV positive, you transit into AIDS quicker and die 20% sooner if you're in the closet compared to out of the closet. Now, homosexual men have been very intensively studied precisely because of their connection to HIV. And the first couple of studies I looked at, they corrected for everything they could think of: ethnicity, socioeconomic class, blah, blah, blah. But they were not correcting for unsafe sex. Now, why is that relevant? Let's say I've got HIV, a strain in here, and then some man kindly donates a second strain to me. Now the two strains are in competition in me, and that will tend to increase their replication, which is going to tend to bring on AIDS quicker. So you want to control for that. So my notion, I'm not even going to ask you for the show of hands, we're probably on the same wavelength on this, is that you're more likely to have unprotected sex if you're in the closet. So I say if you're out of the closet, you got 3 condoms on you and 1 in the boot in case there's an orgy, right? Now, if you're in the closet, you go out with your heterosexual friends, couple married couples, someone else. You have no intention to have sex, but after 4 drinks and it's midnight, your car turns left instead of right, and you end up there with no condom. So, lo and behold, they had 2 studies, the most recently, that corrected for unprotected sex. Goes in just the direction I'm saying. It is significantly associated with being in the closet, but when you correct for that factor, the major correlation is virtually in fact, it's as robust as before. So this is not being caused, this correlation with HIV positive men is not being caused by the connection to unsafe sex. Okay. I'll mention 2 things real quickly. There's a chapter on self-deception in airplane crashes. Some people say I flew from Chicago to Boston, and I love that chapter. Other people say I felt more comfortable waiting till I was on the ground to read that chapter. But I analyzed the crash of Air Florida Flight 90 years ago that took off from National D.C. Airport and ended up in the Potomac River in terms of deceit and self-deception between the pilot and the co-pilot. And then, you know, that was before Google and so on. We'd just have a folder, and every time there's a plane crash, in went the story. And I was consulted by the U.S. Army for some manual and cockpit conversations. In any case, I kept up with the subject. Now, here's a striking single fact. And again, on its face, it's counterintuitive. Pilots fly the plane 50% of the time, and co-pilots fly it 50% of the time. Of course, when the co-pilot is flying, the pilot is still in charge. When Chessie Sullenberger runs into a set of geese there in New York City, because the co-pilot was flying, Chessie says, "My plane," and the co-pilot says, "Your plane," and then Chessie lands the damn thing on the Hudson River. But in any case, the point is this: 80% of accidents occur while the pilot is flying. Now, how does that make sense? Ain't he the more experienced one? Ain't he putatively the better pilot? Et cetera, et cetera. Ain't he the pilot and the other guy the co-pilot? So why should it be more likely that you're going to die if the pilot's flying the airplane? And careful work suggests that the major problem with the pilot flying is a dominance relationship in the cockpit in which the co-pilot may be inhibited from speaking up. And this was especially true of Korean Airlines for a period of time. And Korea, I understand the Korean language has some hierarchical terms, and in the cockpit, there's pilot-san or whatever, and you sort of are obsequious around him. And it was the relationship was symbolized by the fact that a Korean airline pilot once backhanded a co-pilot for making a modest suggestion to improve things. And they literally had Korean Airlines planes flying straight into a mountain in Indonesia with the co-pilot saying, "Pilot-san, I think perhaps a slight adjustment now might be appropriate." Bam! You know. So, and incidentally, now what the hell was incidentally on that? Incidentally, the worst configuration, which confirms this logic, is when the co-pilot and pilot are flying for the first time together. Because if you're the pilot and I'm the co-pilot, but we've flown together a number of times, we may be friends by now, and I may be able to say to you, Phil, I think, blah, blah, blah. But if it's the first time we're flying, you're more likely to get that hierarchical structure that inhibits me from speaking up. So it's as if with a pilot flying, you only got one in the cockpit if there's a sufficiently strong dominance hierarchy. Okay, there's a whole chapter on it, including space disasters thrown in for good measure. One last thing. This a paper just came across my desk, and I was just trying to get some of the details straight in my head. Willingness to share research data is related to the strength of the evidence and the quality of reporting of statistical results. PLOS 1 just came out November 2011. All right. It turns out the American Psychological Association publishes like 50 journals, and if you get a paper accepted, you sign a contract that states that you were willing to share the original data with anybody writing. So do they? No. The first study showed that 75% don't share the data. They just scientists sit down and write a bunch of authors and say, we'd like your data. All right. Now, 25% never answer. Another 30% say they are, and as they pointed out, 6 years later, they still haven't gotten it. 6 say they can't share it because either the data are lost or it's too hard for them to manipulate in a form to share it. Now, then they go ahead and show that this tendency to share is related to statistical slovenliness, let's call it. There's a series of minor errors you can make. You can round off 0.058 down to 0.05, which is where you want it. 0.058 is technically not publishable. It's not a scientifically valid fact. So they showed that the more the data were close to 0.05, the less likely they are to share it. And then they did the statistics themselves, these authors, for papers that provided sufficient information, degrees of freedom, what the variance was, and so on. And they find that failure to share is positively associated with numbers of statistical errors. Okay, so science, if you can call psychology a science yet, but as newborn sciences at least, I got this problem. I'm sure other more mature sciences have it as well. So anyway, sorry.
Four questions. So the first one is, if we don't actually have the data, then how do we know what the errors were?
They publish it.
But they publish their statistical results. They don't publish their raw data. I thought the whole point was that they don't share their raw data.
No, they don't share their raw data, but in some of the papers, and I don't know statistics, I mean, I know its utility and I know it conceptually, but if you put a gun to my head, I could not do a t-test, all right? So, however, they look at papers that have sufficient details so that they themselves can run the test. And they will find out that people make the various kinds of errors. They'll make it a one-tailed test when it should be 2. Or it already is a one-tailed test, but they divide by 2 in order to make it a one-tailed test.
I see.
Those kind of mistakes. I mean, they're fairly, or the rounding mistakes I just mentioned.
But I mean, like, they can only do this kind of analysis to find the mistakes? Or they look at the papers themselves in the calculations that are actually
right, and they're just saying even on that basis, where we don't even know the data, we can see that there are errors being made systematically which tend to be in their direction and tend to be most common when you're right around 0.05, the break-even point, right? If you're way down there at 0.001, you don't need to lie.
So if you're going to lie big.
Beg your pardon?
So if you're going to lie in a psychology paper, lie big.
Lie big, that's right. Lie big and lie often. I don't know. Anyway, I'm a little bit sensitive to it because I published I didn't publish it. I was one of 7 authors on a lead article in a cover story in Nature back in 2005. And we were using my Jamaican students measured for degree of bodily symmetry 3 different times, followed for 15 years and blah, blah, blah. But we used motion capture camera work to capture dance. And so that's how you get published in Nature. You have a new methodology and then some striking results. You're in the door. So if we just took videos, so we were trying to have people correlate dancing ability with how symmetrical you are. Symmetry is good for traits in which on average people are symmetrical. You're healthier, you're better looking, you're stronger, you run faster, etc. There's a whole series of positive correlates in ourselves and other species. So we were curious about dancing ability, and Jamaica is a society where people dance easily and often and so forth and so on. So if we took videos of people dancing, there would be a problem, because since you're better looking if you're symmetrical, we might see a good-looking guy like you, and actually you can't dance very well, but we up you a little bit because of the looks, right? So using motion capture camera is beautiful, because we then created a whole bunch of, they were more than stick figures, a little bit more than more humanoid than a stick figure, but they're basically a stick figure that was identical across all dances, okay? So when we brought that back down and had the people evaluated for dancing ability, they're only looking at the phenotype of the dance. We showed a number of striking results. The entire thing, like Germans would say, is ganz Quatsch. It's complete nonsense. My postdoc sat there and invented the whole goddamn thing, right down to changing. When I discovered he'd done this, it was like a knife in my heart. He'd actually changed the FA values. I mean, our whole project is based, FA is fluctuating asymmetry. Our whole project is based on the fact that we're measuring degree of asymmetry. Now, we had proven that that the paper was a fraud to, well, 1 in 10 million. But when we submitted to Nature an attempt to retract it, Nature asked for all the original data plus the original animations, and going through the tables one night of his data set and mine, you had to go about 22 dancers down before they were chosen, or subjects before they were chosen for the dance. I realized, God damn, he's got a wrong FA value. And so out of the 80 FA values, he falsified 65. Out of all of the non-dancers, which was way more than 80, maybe 230, there was only one that was wrong. We think he falsified it and then forgot to change it back when he didn't use it. So that alone is less than 1 in a billion. So you multiply the two together and we're up in the gazillions. Now Rutgers has been, NSF supported it. If NSF supports work, or NIH, and fraud is alleged, it kicks the problem back to the institution that received the money and says, you do an investigation. And the institutions take as long as they possibly can. I'm very cynical about institutions regarding fraud. They'd all wish the problem went away. And NSF, by the way, holds a cudgel over Rutgers' head and says, we can stop all NSF-supported money to Rutgers, we can stop all to the anthropology department, or we can keep Dr. Trivers and Cronk from ever getting NSF money. So they have reprisals that force Rutgers to do the job. Well, almost. It's over 2 years now since they started their investigation. They still haven't revealed a thing. But I discovered they had hired a statistician who proved something very nice. The fraudster changed, oh, well, hell, you don't want to hear all the goddamn details of my life with this fraud, you know. But anyway, since I'm into the sentence, I'll be done with it. Let's say your ears are 1 millimeter difference okay, that's the degree of asymmetry between your ears. Now let's say mine are 2 millimeters apart, but my head's twice as big. So we always divide, so that's the same degree of asymmetry. So you divide the asymmetry by the trait size. So that was the key fact that he changed, but then he didn't bother to program his computer so that it automatically changed the values on either side so as to be consistent. So his data are also internally completely inconsistent. You understand what I'm saying? In other words, if you divide the FA values in his files by the trait size, you don't get the falsified values. If he was a little bit, so now I don't know what the probability is. I think it's less than the number of atoms in the universe, you know, the inverse of that. And who knows when Rutgers will finally fess up to it, you know. Anyway. Let me just pretend to summarize this just by saying this is a topic that goes from, you know, our innermost relations intimate relations with other people, husband, wife, children, parents, even conversations we have with ourselves. And then it goes all the way up to societal disasters. Misguided, stupid, and disastrous wars often have a real component of self-deception. Alas, the people planning and running the war rarely suffer the consequences these days. 100,000 Iraqis may die, 4 million displaced, terrorism way, way up since this mad response to 9/11. But the people that designed it are doing just fine as far as you can tell. It's a little unfortunate feature of self-deception at the mega level. Other people will suffer the cost, or may suffer the cost, but not the perpetrators. And then the garbage you hear about economics these days, I mean, it just is incredible. I don't know the field, but I know more than the nonsense they're talking. Or take something that amuses the hell out of me. If you suggest that the wealthy should pay a little bit more in taxes so as to get a fair distribution, or a more fair distribution, they say, class warfare, class warfare. Bullshit. Class warfare is when the peasants with their pitchforks come into the king's area. That's class warfare. These demonstrations throughout the country are trying to bring in a little bit of class consciousness. I like the guy in New York that had a sign saying, hungry, eat a banker. But that's not much class warfare. That's a little class comment. So in any case, this is a topic that ranges up and down, and we can all contribute to it. Any discipline we're working in has material on it. If you're an expert in Shakespearean plays, you can find deceit and self-deception in his plays. And even if we're not in an academic discipline, we all practice it and we're all victimized by it. So we can study it around us and in principle make valuable observations. The man that works on my property in Jamaica, I'm explaining to them this voice going up, and he says to me, well, does that mean that if you confront a person and accuse them of a lie, that their voice will tend to go up? And I said, I'll bet you it's true, and I wish you'd have said that to me 9 months ago, because it would be a speculation in my book. Okay. Thank you for your attention. Yes?
Please speak to the role self-deception plays in people actively choosing to do something they know is wrong.
Can you give me an example? Because the way you're putting it, it's like it's almost as if you're excluding self-deception. They actively do it even though they know it's wrong. So what's the example? Where's the self-deception there? That they
couldn't possibly harm anyone, even if it does, it doesn't matter.
Okay, so yes, there's a whole literature on that thing that
like bankers deciding to roll together derivatives.
What's that?
Like bankers deciding to roll together derivatives and sell them, and
right.
So on.
Yes. Well, there is a literature, and it's robust. That doesn't mean I can pull out the nice example or two that I trust is in the first chapter of my book, but it's well known that people definitely want to keep up an image of being moral, or more or less moral, among, in a group living species where we care about things like that. And so there's all kinds of mental operations that go on, biased remembering, biased reporting, biased this and that allow you to do what is obviously immoral or inappropriate action and still keep a facade up. But if you want a specific example of such a maneuver, I'd have to think about it. They ran the following strange experiment. They've got someone pretending to be handicapped or crippled, and they've got someone else who's pretending to be normal and on a bus or something, and they're each watching what? A TV screen, something like this. I don't know whether it's a bus or a room or something. Now you walk in and you've got a choice of which two seats to sit next to. Now, if they're watching the same program, you sit next to the crippled person as if demonstrating you ain't got no bias. But if you can be given a reason to express your bias, such as the fact they're watching different programs, you now decide that this program's more interesting, okay? But your real reason, I mean, the correlation is not with the program. They're reversing those. It's simply with, are the two people watching the same programs or different programs? So there's lines of research like that where if you give people an option to make it look, to rationalize it, they go for it. Okay? Yes?
Do you distinguish between self-deception where you know some glimmer is true, like you're in the closet, versus self-deception where you have no idea it's true? Like, I lived 1,000 years ago and I believe the Earth is flat. Because the latter doesn't seem to be explained by your theory of why self-deception.
Wait a second now. I felt all right until you said that. So what's your statement again now? Well, first of all, I mean, let me just make a general statement. Of course, a more sophisticated account of this doesn't just talk about conscious and unconscious, because we know there's a graded series of steps between complete unconsciousness, I don't know what the F you're talking about, and semi-consciousness, or, well, there's no such thing as complete consciousness. To be conscious of some things, you have to be unconscious of other things, you know. The question is whether you're doing that in a biased and self-serving way. But what were you saying about flat earthers didn't seem to fit into my theory or something like that?
Just, if I'm a true flat earther, right, and it doesn't seem that believing in a flat earth helps me to deceive others in any way. You know, this is just the facts I have, I believe it. It doesn't seem to help me.
Well, I don't know. For a brief period of time, I debated a young earth creationist. I mean, these people are really Looney Tunes. In other words, they calculate backwards from the Bible, and the whole world was invented 6,000 years ago. Begat, begat, begat. They multiply by 30 or whatnot, and they've got 6,000 years. So I can't even remember the guy's name again, but I was getting $1,000, and there were biologists that said, you're giving him prominence, and I said, I'll debate the devil for $1,000. And back then, the $1,000 meant a lot. But in that case, the guy is promoting himself as someone with an important intellectual contribution that runs counter to received wisdom, and so he was definitely pumping himself up. He had money coming in. He filmed the damn thing, and then I agreed to just get $2 per copy he sells. I'm an economic nitwit, and he got $8, only he didn't pay my money after a while. Then I had to harass him about that. He actually went to jail because he also fought the IRS, and the IRS is a worse entity to fight than me, and to end up on the losing end of the stick. But I'm saying there's an example where he's talking gun squatch, but where he's promoting himself, you know. As you know, there's this notion that they're passing around now that us scientists are so pathetic that for grant money, we're willing to we're willing to create a fiction about global warming and that humans have something to do with it just in order to get grants. Well, we all know that people are willing to fudge around to get grants, but we also know as scientists that if you can prove that global warming is scientific nonsense, you really rise in status, right? You know, we have our eyes out for major contradictions in what is generally accepted, because that's high payoff if you prove that. If you just prove that this, yet another iteration of this argument is true in that situation, it's relatively minor. But anyway.
One more question?
Not even one. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.